we have what I think will be a fascinating panel for you. The title you can see, Inequality, Past, Present, and Future. And this panel is really partly inspired by a couple of books, one of which is extremely well known, one slightly less well known, about inequality and trends in inequality over a time period. So most of you will own a copy of Thomas Piketty's book, Capital. Some of you will have opened it. I read it from cover to cover, but on a Kindle, so I couldn't actually read the graphs, but I got the main point. And of course, from Piketty, we have the claim that there's a type of natural tendency for inequality to grow over time. If the rate of return on investment is faster than economic growth, then the rich will get richer faster than the poor will get richer. And so for Piketty, there's a natural tendency for inequality to develop. A bit later on, another book came out by a Stanford academic called Walter Seidel, called The Great Leveler. And Seidel took a much longer period of history. And he seems also to be of the view that inequality will grow of its own accord. But he says there are some things that will at least limit the growth of inequality and even reverse it. His first example is the Black Death. So the Black Death reduced inequality, apparently. So did the Second World War and the First World War. And Seidel's claim is that there are only, in the historical record, there are only 4 types of events that have reversed inequality on a great scale: war, disease, revolution, and state collapse. And so if you're a policymaker who is against inequality, you have a bit of a puzzle about what you do. So what we're doing really on this panel is to see actually whether there are things that can reverse inequality. And we have 2 fantastic presentations for you. One from Clive Cowdery. Clive is the chair founder of the Resolution Foundation, which I think is probably the most respected of the think tanks. Do you call it a think tank or foundation, or at least social science researchers groups that are putting data into the public debate? And I've seen a lot of your data, I've seen a certain amount of your analysis, and I haven't seen any criticism of it. I think that can't be right, but I don't remember seeing it attacked, certainly not for any ideological reasons, left or right. So I think it is treated as an impartial source. Amy Bogaard is, I think, the first archaeologist who's ever spoken at the school. I'm not sure about that. Certainly the first Bronze Age archaeologist who's ever spoken at the school. And Amy, just by chance, got in touch with the school to see if we could make any connection. And when I heard about her work, I thought it would be fantastic for this panel. Because Amy is looking at in a way, the longest time series for inequality, going back a large number of years, but I'll let her tell you that in due course, and really to test the claims of what has been done to reverse inequality, what sorts of things might be done. So we have those 2 presentations, and afterwards I'll also make a short presentation about material inequality and social inequality. So Clive, may I ask you to start?
Yes, you may. Thank you, Joe. Well, Resolution's normally in the position of being seen as the very long-term thinkers against the shortness of a political cycle, a 5-year cycle. When we look back over several political cycles and comment on whether or not the country's getting better or worse on some of the key measures about whether the people in this country are having a lived experience that is improving. So it is with great humility I'm sat here with Amy today, of course, who's going to put what we think of as long-term in a completely different context, looking back over millennia. But as Joe said, we are impartial at Resolution. We've spent the last 15 years looking at the question, not from a political perspective, but from a social perspective, about whether the country's living standards are improving for the bottom third of workers, sometimes called low to middle income, so deciles 2 to 5, I guess, in total. I'd like to share some facts regarding the lived experience of those people for you today and try and answer this question that Joe has faced about whether inequality is, first of all, improving or getting worse, and secondly, whether there's something other than causing a war, a plague, or a famine that governments could do in order to improve the situation. So let's just take a quick look at the past. I think many of the people in this room will be familiar with the concept of the Gini coefficient, a measure about whether countries are equal or unequal, remembering, of course, that 0 would be a theoretically perfect country in terms of no inequality, and 1 would be a really, really nasty place to live. And so where are we? Well, we, and across most Western democracies, are poised uneasily midway between those points. You can see that by looking at the countries on this chart. I'd like to draw attention to two things. The first is that clutch of countries in the middle. Germany, the UK, and surprisingly, you might think, the US are all pretty equal to each other. Not very equal as countries, I'm afraid. With a coefficient of 0.5, there is really quite substantial inequality in those countries. But the first point I draw attention to, as you look at the top line there, is that the naturally occurring rate of inequality, as Joe mentioned, has been referenced by Piketty and others, the amount of inequality that's here before we, the people, exercising our power through government, choose to change it, is around the same. And perhaps the image in your mind is of the US and Germany as being very different. Germany you might think of as a more equal country than rampant Anglo-Saxon capitalism. It looks like Rhinish capitalism and Anglo-Saxon capitalism produce pretty much the same starting point in terms of inequality. But now look at the difference between the white boxes here and the coloured boxes beneath them. When government begins to act, it has a variable degree of success in reducing that inequality. In the case of the US, you can see that the 0.51 Gini coefficient reduces just to 0.39. So roughly 40. However, Germany, with the same starting point, gets that number all the way down to 0.29. Governments, public policy, and effective execution can make a difference. Just to look at the UK in that context, we have exactly the same starting point. We don't do as well as Germany. We do better than the United States. We are an unequal country. Government and policy can make a difference. It hasn't always been that bad. If you look at the left of this chart here, this is now narrowly focusing on our country, on Britain, you can see that the Gini coefficient was somewhere between 0.25 and 0.3 for many, many years. If you look all the way back to the 1960s, you can see that top blue line and then the slightly dotted blue line above it, I'll explain that in a second, right from 66 through to the early part of the 80s, we're running roughly at around 0.25. We're now double that number. That's a huge and shocking change in the inequality of this country. What happened? We'll look at the years that followed, and you can see that the whole issue is about the 1980s. Something dramatic changed in this country in the way we perceived how much inequality we were prepared to live with. Again, resolution starts from no party political perspective, but clearly something was happening in the 1980s that led to an outcome of a severe inequality. I said I'd comment on the dotted blue line. Keep an eye on it. I'm going to come back to it at the end. After housing costs, I'm afraid we're even more unequal. That's the dotted line. Housing is the next huge scandal in our country. What was happening? What happened in the 1980s? The answer was there was a single, exciting, new, fresh, and totally wrong economic theory. It was called trickle-down. And the idea, which had some appeal to rich people, was that staying rich and getting richer somehow helped the poor. Not a difficult sell to people with money and assets. And in two great countries, that idea was put to work and tested. It was in the United States and in the UK. Quite an accident of history that around the same period, two large developed countries happened to pass political power to people prepared to test this untested theory on real live human beings. That theory was then leading to a number of things that happened in the 80s. Tax cuts for the rich, interesting and novel idea. In the past, that had never been thought of, that the rich needed the tax cuts. And indeed, we saw the tax rate drop from 83 to 40%. halving. Sometimes, even today, I go to places where that's quoted like a good thing, something that happened in the country and is somehow indicated that the country was on the right path. Deregulation occurred, labour law. There was certainly a need to look at the huge amount of regulation that lay behind business practices in the 50s, 60s and 70s that needed change, and those were changed in the 80s. Some of that was positive, but it also led to the ability to hire and fire people so rapidly that there was absolutely no job security. And that also led through to that same deregulation had an impact on housing and housing insecurity and tenure as well. That also was seen with the weakening of trade unions. Trade union participation in our country has halved, actually, during that period. Privatisation had two impacts. One, it had an impact on what we considered as a collective was the right entitlement to public services. So there was almost a social or moral question. But actually, purely practically, if you picked up 100 workers that used to work for a government department and you moved them to a different entity and pay was more unequal in the new entity, then the more you do that, then on average across the country, you're beginning to change the level of equality as well. And the broad theory had the belief that high and lasting unemployment was somehow a price worth paying for lower inflation. Ideas, policies have consequences. Government matters. It matters for good, or as we can see here, it matters for the less good. What we then saw, of course, was the inequality that led to that huge bubble I showed you 2 charts ago. During that whole period, 1997 is what we've captured here through to 91, we saw income growth for sure, but we saw less than a 1% annual income growth over the 14 years referenced there, if you're at the bottom end of the earnings scale. If you're in the middle management, skilled workers, you did better than that. You got 3% on average every year. If you're in the top tier of earning people in this country, you got nearly 5 times what you got at the bottom. No wonder we went from a Gini coefficient of 0.25 to 0.5. We doubled the amount of inequality on income in the country. And the top 1% didn't stop there. If you look back all the way to the 60s, the top 1% have always owned more than 1% of the wealth, or of the income in this case. I must move to wealth in a moment. But of income, more than 1% was owned by the 1%, than the top 1% of earners. That you would see in any broadly distributed economy. But the idea that that should go from 4 to nearly 10 without public comment. A huge rise where one part of the population, I flush with shame, I'm in that group, was able to capture 10% of the income of the country, and no one did anything, burnt any buildings, fired anyone. Crazy. That's where we're at. Question is, can it get better? Well, I'm afraid to say we now have real pessimism across policymakers about whether this can be improved. The whole point Joe said at the introduction to this section is that there are many, many people who think that the only way to change this, as it's a naturally occurring phenomena, is through natural disasters and things that are externally impacting us. I do not believe that, and you've seen from the evidence of the negative that policy can make a change. We can see, however, the size of the challenge today. If you look at the peaking on average earnings, weekly earnings of around 500, just over about 503 pounds a week, this is where we peaked just before the crash, the average earner. We saw that dramatically dropped post the crash. It will be 17 years after the crash before we're back to the level. Who can live with 17 years of no wage growth? Worse, 17 years in which you were clawing your way back to your earlier level. That's the country we're living in, again, with surprisingly little public comment. History shows, just as we saw on the negative, that there are positive things you can do about this. And that is singly my message for today. We have had moments during the last 20 years where we have deliberately and on purpose, as if we, the people, ran the country, tried to change that. We've had new policies with new priorities. That led, first of all, in 1999 to a new national minimum wage. It was launched at £3.60 an hour. It was derided by large groups of people as likely to put millions of people out of work. It didn't lead to a single job loss. And as of last night, or as of Monday after the budget, that number is now £7.83, a British success. We've doubled the national minimum wage, largely through the introduction in 15 of the national living wage that tops it up. We've now begun to address the fact that the reversal of taxes for the rich might have gone too far. We're now back to 50% tax rate on income for higher earners. That's dropped back recently under a recent government change to 45. So a little bit of regression there on an otherwise progressive move. But we've also begun to remove complete free money for high earners on their pension schemes and pension arrangements over the last few years. And that trend continued on Monday in the budget. So policy is beginning to make a difference. Cash support for people in work has been the largest and most important thing we've done to provide underpins. So tax credits, an idea that began under the Clinton administration in the US, and which we lifted here, where the household's income is topped up with reference to how many children or how many dependents are in there, has been the biggest part of that. Childcare support is a huge and important thing. We now have in this country 30 hours of free childcare if you have a 3 or a 4-year-old child in your home, and that just wasn't there 10 or 15 years ago. Good things are making a difference to the outcomes that people have. We can see this beginning to work through. This isn't just theory. Since the living wage came in 15, look at the 2 bars there on the left of that chart. Growth in real hourly earnings was captured by deciles 1 and deciles 2. Thank God. And there you see the rest of it just more evenly spread from there. We can see a second example of that, child poverty. We had some very ambitious aims to change child poverty in the country over the last 20 years. Interesting for those of you that study the effectiveness of government and its reliance on data, and I know that data must be a large part of what's taught in this building and the importance of using real data. The blue line reflects what we all thought up to about 6 months ago had been our success in tackling child poverty. Very interesting. You can see that we started with child poverty in the early 90s of something like around 32, 33, and it looks like we only at its best just before the crash got that number down to the high 20s, 27. What we discovered, the country discovered through going back and trawling actual payments out to children in need, is that people were underreporting what they were in receipt of because they were embarrassed. And if you actually count dollars out the door, rather than what people said they received, you get the red line. And you can see they were already getting more than they told us in the early 90s, but you can see that we managed to get child poverty down to 20% before the crash began. Not low enough, but a huge impact of a properly put together and implemented series of government policies linked to the right outcome, a more equal society. But we still have some things we need to do. We have a growing housing crisis. I referenced that at the start. Housing costs have risen 4 times faster than incomes. Maintaining some way for workers to have a voice when trade union membership, as I said, has halved from 57 to just 24% today. We have less 5% of workers, if they are low paid, even bother joining a union. What does it do for me? Why would I pay to do that? And in a gig economy, what union? Who are you going to work with? Who else can you get collective action from in order to do things? Resolution funds 2 interesting, new, as yet experimental ways to try and address that. One's called the labour exchange that matches off people in the gig economy with people that want hourly work. And the others is a group that allows people who are in the gig economy to get online and join others in the same position and make a petition. And that's already had changes in McDonald's and Tesco's and other large employers in their working practice who are very surprised to get not the 1 or 2 complaint from one single McDonald's that they might get, but suddenly they're getting thousands because these people are linking up and bringing their collective voice to work. But finally, the thing we still need to tackle is the rise of the top 1%. I think any country with that level of accretion of income to one particular part of the society is going to face social issues that I'm sure Joe will address as part of his comments. Finally, let me end with wealth. We've talked about income. Do you remember that Gini coefficient number after government action? I gave you 51 to start with, but I showed you that we, the country, reduced that through our actions and decisions to 0.35. So take that number at the bottom of the chart, and that's your starting point. That's where incomes are. Net household incomes have a Gini coefficient of 0.35. Look what happens when we start to look at the wealth lens. First of all, total wealth, we're really unequal. 0.62. Net property wealth is higher still. Not that surprising, considering that most of our wealth as the country is tied up in our property. We have a Gini coefficient of 0.67. I don't know if you're blushing with shame. That's a very high number for a country that claims to be egalitarian and interested in the outcomes of all of its citizens. The net property wealth in this country has a coefficient for equality of 0.67. Then you add in the pensions, where for decades we just seemed to think it was better for rich people to have better pensions than poor people, and to be given more public subsidy for that from the public purse. That's led to an outcome where 0.72, these are horrifyingly high numbers, but then you get to the real killer. When you put all financial wealth, money in stocks and shares, bonds, investments together, this country has a Gini coefficient on wealth of 0.91. We started this entire conversation by saying a theoretically perfect country would have 0 and a theoretically horrendous country would have 1. We're at 0.91 on wealth. Where do we go? Well, first of all, we have to see that there's not going to get better by itself, it's getting worse. The purple line at the bottom shows you what a millennial versus the blue line at the top shows you what a baby boomer are going to be able to afford with a house. And I mention a house because it's the largest store of public wealth or private wealth in the country. And you can see there from the connecting point there with the dotted line that it's exactly twice as many people who were able to own a house at the age of 30 than they are today. So we've halved the number of people who can begin to accrete wealth for themselves. We can't go that direction. And you can see that it's because we are not being prepared to apply the largest lever that government has available to it. We used to have around a 2.5 to 1 relationship between national income, that's really just tax, money we're prepared to take off people, and the money they've got when we don't take it off people. And that was 2.5 to 1. We now have a 7 times. Look at the chart over on the right, 7 to 1. In other words, over an entire period from 1965, look how flat that line is at the bottom, we have somehow not got our heads around the fact that in a world of exploding private wealth, we should take more of it to meet collective needs and outcomes. We'll have to be smart, we'll have to be thoughtful. Everyone has a problem in government how you sell tax to the populace and how you make it fair and equal and show that it's got value. Those, again, many of the things I'm sure taught and studied in this building. But there's only one direction here. It's exactly as Piketty put in his book, we're headed for wealth taxes. Why are we taxing the labor that's happening and not the wealth that's accreted? Much of it in a generation where we're going to see by 2035 a doubling of inheritance tax in this country from where we are today. A doubling, not of a tax rather, but a doubling of inheritance. More than twice the amount that's inherited this year will be inherited in 2035. In that context, why are we not shifting the attention away from income taxes and towards wealth? John Stuart Mill said the following. He said, the private landlord, let's say the owner of assets today, and the welfare recipient are morally equal, for they both derive their living by the sweat of another man's brow. People with assets have earned all the money they need before they left the house in the morning. And we don't tax that. But we tax the poor guy that got up, pulled his shirt on, and went to work. So where are we? Inequality is high. There's widespread pessimism, a shrug of resignation that you need a famine or a plague. But I believe, or I hope I've shown you that that's not true. Just like poor interventions have added to inequality, good interventions can reduce it. And so our task today in policy circles is to communicate what's worked in the past and learn from it, to learn lessons from what's been overlooked and make sure we address it with increased urgency, and to prepare for what we can all see and predict is a world of increasing inequality unless and until we, the people, decide to act. Thank you.
Are your slides publicly available? Yeah. Okay. So I saw some of you desperately trying to take photos of Clive's slides there. Clive has said that the slides can be made publicly available. They're probably on the resolution website already. So
ad nauseum.
Yeah. So if you can't find them on the resolution website, let us know and we'll make them available. Thanks so much. So, Amy, over to you to show how short a time 40 years is.
Okay, well, as Monty Python said, now for something completely different. I'm very jealous of the resolution and detail of the data that Clive has been able to show us. You have to accept that if we want to look at a much deeper time span, It's the equivalent of sort of unfocusing your eyes and picking out the major features and the major trends over time. And I'd like to use the next 15 minutes or so just to conjure up for you the kinds of evidence that we have access to archaeologically and the kinds of efforts that are being made collaboratively across the discipline now of archaeology to enter this conversation of where inequality is headed and what we can do about it. I've chosen the time frame of the last 10,000 years, and that is a convenient chunk of time. We have more time than we can possibly deal with in archaeology. But it aligns with the current climatic era that we are in, the Holocene. So 10,000 years ago, roughly, a bit more than that, we're talking about the end of the last ice age. And in ecological terms, what that means is an increase in temperature and also in the stability of climate conditions. And that is broadly then the context for one of the major developments of this era, which is the settling down, the development of sedentism in different ways around the world as groups found that there were enough resources in their local environment to maintain their way of life the year round without having to move residentially. And so what we see as the eventual consequence, this is after a couple thousand years of Holocene climate conditions, what we see is the development of housing. Clive was talking about housing just now. And we see these are all examples from Western Asia or the Middle East, different sites that have been excavated. But I chose this set just to give you an impression of the different kinds of housing that emerge. And these housing arrangements include not only living space, but also, importantly for this discussion, storage space. Because these are now people who are practicing agriculture. They're growing crops, those crops have a shelf life, and that means that stuff can be squirreled away for months or even years in order to tide these households, these families, from one year to the next. And it turns out that these data that we have on housing, the size of housing, and also the scale of storage that these houses have inside them, give us some traction on the problem of inequality at the level of the individual household. So to what extent and at what point do we start to see some households apparently lifting off in terms of inequality, wealth inequality, from the wider community? This is a topic that is not just of interest to me. I'm one of many archaeologists who are increasingly cognizant of the potential of our data and in a way feel a responsibility to tell people outside our narrow discipline about it. And one book I can recommend is this one, which was published earlier this year. Yes, it was this year, edited by Tim Kohler and Mike Smith, who are both archaeologists who work actually in the Americas. So this is a global effort where we're trying to look at long-term changes in inequality over time and the different kinds of ways in which inequality has been dealt with. I don't need to explain the Gini coefficient to you, so I will skip past that. But it turns out that the Gini coefficient is also a useful currency for us in archaeology, because to the extent that we can quantify wealth from things like house size and storage capacity, we have a means of looking at the distribution of material wealth. So I should emphasize that the way in which I will talk about wealth here is not in terms of income, but I'll go back to that distinction, that important distinction that Clive made between a Gini coefficient based on income and often a higher Gini coefficient based on cumulative wealth. And it's the latter that we think we have access to through these kinds of data archaeologically. Now, there's one other factor I want to put into the mix before I start showing you Gini coefficients of ancient societies. And that is that we know these farming systems, these agricultural systems that supported these sedentary communities starting to develop into towns and cities, we know that they had a whole repertoire of different kinds of agricultural practice. And I don't need to go into this in great detail. In fact, there's just two factors that I want to mention. One is the extent to which production depended on human labor, as opposed to the labor of animals, things like cattle, also equids, Animals, in other words, that can be harnessed, can be yoked up to pull a plow. Now, that may seem like a very arcane factor to pull out, but it turns out in these pre-industrial, pre-modern farming systems, the availability of animal muscle power, but also especially access to specialized plow animals, specially raised for the purpose, trained, and so on, really has a revolutionary effect on the potential scale of agricultural production. So possession or non-possession or access to plow animals like this could really change by factors of 5 or even 10 the agricultural production that a small-scale family would be capable of. And just to underline the importance of that, I want to show you here some results of a paper that a whole group of us published last year. In fact, this was one of the outcomes of that 10,000 years of inequality research collaboration that I mentioned before. But this is where we were pulling out long-term trends in inequality between Eurasia, on the one hand, and the New World, the Western Hemisphere, the Americas, on the other. And in these two graphs, Eurasia is shown by the blue line, and you can see time on the horizontal axis, and the Americas are shown by the red line. So if we look first at the upper graph, the somewhat depressing outcome for Eurasia is that inequality has been increasing. And we're using here the very same currency, the very same terms, the Gini coefficient that Clive was talking about before. But this is now based not on income, but on what we can see of accumulated wealth. Now, clearly that increase in Eurasia has something to do with farming, because farming involves production of, well, crops that have a shelf life, can be stored, can be accumulated to some extent. And of course, livestock also have that, in fact, even more so, have that banking potential. But whereas we see an uplift over time in inequality in Eurasia, in the Americas, the picture isn't so clear at all. In fact, we have all kinds of ups and downs. You can see that wiggly line, red line on the right-hand side in the upper graph, but we don't see a trend towards increase. If you look at the lower graph now, this is now doing something quite clever. I can say that because it wasn't my idea. But it's using as the 0 point, the point at which agriculture becomes established. So what you're seeing is, in both cases, there's some uplift in inequality just with farming and as a result of material production and accumulation. But the really nasty bit in Eurasia happens towards the right-hand side, where we see inequality lift off from the trend line in the Americas. So there is a factor that is multiplying the ability for wealth accumulation, differential wealth accumulation in Eurasia. And our leading hypothesis about what that is traction animals. Because traction animals themselves can be owned, and more importantly, they can enable people who are already doing well to monopolize even more land, to practice land-hungry, expansive agriculture, and to ever expand their assets, and of course to pass them down to the next generation. So it's that potential for material accumulation that really accelerates inequality and that persistent distribution in Eurasia. Here's another graph. Now, this is from recent work I've been doing with two economists, Sam Bowles and Mattia Fuscisato. And what we've been doing is further data mining, but now looking specifically at Western Eurasia, so Europe and the Middle East, essentially. And each of these data points represents an archaeological site where we have a good sample of mostly housing, the kind of data that I showed you before. And we're putting particular emphasis here on storage capacity, which most closely aligns then with production and accumulated wealth. You can see, again, the Gini coefficient as the Y, the vertical axis, and timeline is the x-axis. Again, you see an upward trend. That's the same as the blue line that I showed you before. But this starts to give us opportunities to pick out certain communities, certain societies, actually, which are, under different economic circumstances, achieving or giving rise to a certain level of unequal wealth distribution. And one is a site called Çatalhöyük. It's an early Neolithic site in Turkey that I want to show just a couple of slides of. And the second one may also be well known to you, and that is Bronze Age Knossos, the palatial Minoan center on the island of Crete. I've picked these two examples because they have quite similar levels of material wealth inequality, but they have very different institutional arrangements that I think should be added to this conversation about the importance of institutions for moderating potential wealth inequality under different economic circumstances. So, again, I realize this is different to the kind of thing that is normally bandied about at the Blavatnik school. This is Çatalhöyük. This is a big international excavation near Konya. So it's in the Konya province of south-central Turkey. This is an excavation that's been running for the last 25 years. And the beauty of it is we have not then only got access to data from 1 or 2 or 3 houses. We can look at entire neighborhoods, and we can look at how they change through time. It's an established farming settlement, so they have a full complement of farming technologies. And what you can perhaps pick out even from this just first view of the plan is that some houses are much larger than others. So I've picked out an example on the left, and you can see it in reconstruction in this little extra box that I've added. That's a relatively large house by Çatalhöyük standards. It's about 60 square meters, so it's not a penthouse exactly, but it's large. The other house, which I've picked out on the other side, is about 10 or 12 square meters. So there's about a factor of 5 difference in scale, both in the living space and also in the storage space. So that would seem to suggest that even in this early farming community, there is a definite potential for wealth inequality. What's interesting here is that try as we might, and it's, again, I'm one of hundreds of people literally that have worked on this site, we have never found a central plaza or a central temple or palace or any other kind of central institution that is regulating the situation. And this despite the fact that this community surely increased up to into the low thousands at its maximum extent. So this is not a tiny village by early prehistoric standards. This is a fairly significant scale. And what I want to briefly show you, using the example of one building excavated that had been burned at the time of its abandonment, is what we can see institutionally that is going on within the household that enabled this state of affairs to persist, in this case, for 1,000 years. That's the time scale of this settlement, from about 7,000 to about 6,000 BC. So this is real sustainability, demonstrably. So what are they doing in this community? Well, this is one particular building, and I'd quite like to, may I stand up? I'm just going to point out some of its features. I think I have yeah. So I'm going to point out now the footprint of this structure. Okay, so you can see its walls. You can see that part of the house is devoted to storage. That's the clay boxes that you see here. Think of them as cupboards for storing the produce of this family. This would have been the main living space. And you can see that it's burned. You can see the big patches of red and orange. Now, this is a Pueblo-like settlement where you would actually enter not from a doorway at ground level, but by dropping down a ladder from the roof. And you would drop down into this main living area. The first thing you would see is this strange collection of what you can perhaps see are horns. These are the horns of wild cattle, which they're very interested in this settlement. They hunt them. And it includes actually horns that are set into the side of a bench, and another entire head with horns, a bucranium, that is set into a niche in the wall. Why am I talking about this? I want to point out to you that the first thing you would see when you enter this building is this display of what we think are trophies from hunting, and also the parts that you could retain after a major feasting event that you had hosted. So let's say I'm out with a group of hunters, I'm successful in taking down a pretty fierce wild bull, and I've had the right then to retain the horns of these animals, and I must have shared that meat with a very large social group within the community, right? There's no deep chest freezers here. There's no access to copious amounts of salt. There's no way to store meat otherwise. So meat sharing becomes a really important means of social cohesion, we think, in this community. That symbolism of social cohesion is contrasted with what happens with the long-term storage in this room. In order to enter this room, you would have to, well, cross this room, crawl in, literally crawl on all fours. There are small openings between the rooms, not at head height, but at sort of midriff height. So you would crawl into this room, then crawl down this corridor, crawl through another hole, and then you would get access to the storage. So in a nutshell, what we think is happening here at Çatalhöyük is that on the one hand, there is celebration, there is visual display of, in this case, it's cattle horns, but an activity that can be celebrated as something that has to do with social cohesion, meat sharing and hunting. On the other hand, what isn't celebrated in any of the art from this settlement, and there's a large repertoire of wall paintings and so on, but what they never show and they never talk about visually is the fact that there is private storage of certainly crops and other consumables that will have been kept by the household in this very sequestered space. But they find something to celebrate. So that's partly the message that I'm trying to get across here, something that everyone could enjoy and that could be freely shared between these social units. Now, Çatalhöyük may seem very distant, so distant from where we are now that it's difficult to make that leap of imagination. I want to show you another case now. I'm going to skip a couple of slides. There's just too much that I want to show you, really. But I want to show you another example now of a settlement even longer lived than Çatalhöyük. So I explained to you that Çatalhöyük lasts for 1,000 years. Knossos on Crete begins around the same time as Çatalhöyük, 6,800 BC, in the Neolithic period, but then continues right the way through the Neolithic and up to the end of the Bronze Age, and in fact beyond the end of the Bronze Age too. But so as not to overwhelm us, I've stopped the clock here at 1300 BC. And in the last couple millennia, what is the dominant feature of Knossos? Has anyone been there? Anyone visited this site? Okay, so the big obvious feature that you see and that you visit when you go there is the palace. The palace was clearly an integrative institution. It will have had a whole range of functions that I won't unpack for you here. But one of its functions, and the one I really want to emphasize, is storage. All of these strange, narrow rooms that you can see in this aerial photograph, and also these large, round features, all are to do with food storage. And it's been appreciated for a long time with Knossos that one of the big justifications for its existence was the absorption of agricultural risk. So the risks of crop failure that every farming family in that society and across the island of Crete will have been facing from one year to the next. So institutionally, we do have evidence then for definite social hierarchy. There's plenty of iconography at Knossos that shows that there were different social roles and that there may not have been a good deal of social mobility. But on the other hand, the central institution was tolerated precisely because it was playing a very useful role in smoothing out those ups and downs in production, but without being able to monopolize the means of production, the actual ownership of land and so on. And the last thing I'll say is we know from translation of tablets from Knossos, the Linear B tablets you may have heard of, which are the earliest written form of Greek, that they had involvement in the economy, the agricultural economy, but that involvement was very selective. It was only in growing certain crops, and it was only in producing certain kinds of goods. And that, in a sense, if I can make a link back to the UK, going to the palace at Knossos will have been more like going to Buckingham Palace than entering, the central building of an all-controlling totalitarian state. What it redistributed to the wider population was prestigious, but not necessary for everyday subsistence. It didn't have control of the staple economy. And clearly, Knossos is an institution we should be looking at if we're interested in building up an archive even of ancient examples of institutions that have been able to limit material wealth inequality to a Gini of about 0.5. And that's all I've got. Thank you very much.
Okay, well, thank you so much for, as you said, such an unusual presentation for us to have here, but so much to think about. And I don't have any slides, so I'll leave this one up there. So I just want to talk briefly about some recent work and trends in political philosophy and how political philosophy can bear on some of the issues and be, in fact, inspired and informed by some of the issues that we've already heard. So if we were to go back to Piketty, if we think about Gini coefficient, we're thinking in terms of income or, in some cases, wealth or other types of property. So we're looking very much at material inequality. Who's rich, who's poor. But in contemporary political philosophy, people have been very keen to think, well, is that the only way of thinking about equality? Are there other ways of thinking about equality? And there's been a little rash of books with names like A Society of Equals or Living as Equals or Living with Equals. I mean, there's only one idea, but so many books, they have to vary the name a little bit. So all the good names are taken, so I don't know what to call my book when it comes out now. But anyway, if you think about the idea of a society of equals, what does that conjure up to you? So it could be a society where everyone has, roughly speaking, the same income. But it isn't necessarily that. It could be a society of people who treat each other in a particular way or view each other in a particular way. So it's quite common to use metaphors like you don't look up to anyone and you don't look down to anyone. Who do you rub shoulders with? Who do you march step to step with? So there's a whole lot of visual and place-based metaphors to emphasize the idea of somehow solidarity with other people. And so some of the work I've been doing is trying to explore this idea. What is a society of equals? And what is the relation between a society of equals and a society of income or wealth inequality? It may be that the two things are very closely related, of course. It may be that if you have income inequality, you're not going to be able to get social equality, and vice versa. So if you have social inequality, perhaps you'll have income inequality. But that's not so clear. There have been some societies, for example, Soviet Russia, where income distribution, the Gini coefficient was pretty good, I would think. I haven't seen figures, but my guess is that income inequality was pretty flat. Yet no one would say it was really a society of social equality because of the role of the party and party membership. So it's possible to have social inequality, but material equality to some degree. But that's not the typical case. Typically, they're likely to go together. And material inequality is likely to be a cause or a consequence of social inequality. However, if that were true, then social equality ought to be getting worse. But let me read something. It's not often, I think, that John Stuart Mill is the only philosopher quoted, but John Stuart Mill is going to be quoted for a second time today. So let me read something from On Liberty. So John Stuart Mill says, the entire history of social improvement has been a series of transitions by which one custom or institution after another, from being a supposed primary necessity of social existence, has passed into the rank of a universally stigmatized injustice and tyranny. So it has been with the distinction of slaves and freemen, nobles and serfs, patricians and plebeians. And so it will be, and in part already is, with the aristocracies of colour, race and sex, he says. So this was 1859. So it's very interesting that Mill is seeing a direction of progress towards equality. He's not, at this point, arguing anything about material equality or material inequality. He probably wouldn't have had the figures to do it at that point. And so there's an optimistic tale. It also goes along with our pessimistic tale. And if I think about in my own lifetime, when I was born, homosexuality was illegal in this country. Now gay marriage has been accepted. I think I would never have thought that would have been possible, maybe even 10 or 15 years ago. So there's a type of progress of acceptance and the social equality and social inclusion going on at the same time. So I think it's quite important not to lose sight of that. At the same time, we're so far from having solved all of those problems. And I think a lot go with material poverty. So at the bottom end, in a way, we have a type of convergence. Go back to this idea, what is a society of equals? What are the relations between people that makes a society equal? It's actually very hard to say what those relations are. People were writing about this in the 1920s, 1930s. Many of them were Christian socialists, and so used a religious view to think about what a society of equals should be like, but in a more secular age, that no longer seems possible. But what would substitute for sort of religious love for everyone in a secular society? It's very hard to think, what is that relation that makes us equals? What's easier, actually, is to turn it on its head and to ask, what is it that makes us unequals, rather than what is it that makes us equals? So issues of social hierarchy, Tawney, who was a Christian socialist I mentioned, for him, the great enemies of equality, as well as material inequality, of course, but what he talked about was snobbery and servility. So servility in the sense of being servile, looking up to people. Bertolt Brecht, again, uses these images of looking up and looking down. So society of equals is one where you don't look up and you don't look down at others. At the same time, it is an idea that has been ideologically abused. So I was reading recently in post-revolutionary France, because everyone was now an equal under the law, material inequality was sort of ignored or excused. And so if you have this sort of social equality, then maybe we don't have to worry about material equality, which seems like that is a mistake. And I'm also wondering now about Building 52 as well, right. Whereas Building 52 was giving a veneer of social equality, but the material inequality was literally hidden away. Mm-hmm. So it was used to make something more respectable or give an appearance. So it has an ideological use, and this is a danger. So I don't have a lot really to add to this, except that if you think about social equality in what I think of as this negative way, what are the enemies of social equality, then it's quite easy to list them. I've said snobbery and civility, but other philosophers have talked about exploitation, marginalization. I've written about social exclusion, powerlessness, even violence, which is still a big problem even in this country, cultural imperialism. And many other things you can talk about. Social exclusion is one where there's been a lot of work recently. And what it does, actually, quite optimistically for philosophers, is allow us to link with social movements and get out of the idea that philosophy is just something you do in your study. So if you're trying to define the theory of equality, that's something you do on your own. If you're interested in exploitation and domination, you need to talk to people who are studying those things and try to work together to see what we can do. So I think on that note, I will open up the discussion. I think we've already seen the fruitfulness of putting different disciplines together, and maybe we can continue with this. So we've got a couple of microphones. We can go on, I think, until about 15:15. Is that okay? 10 past. We can go on until 10 past. So we've got 20 minutes. So if you catch my eye, it's a gentleman there, and let's go here. So, yes, please.
Okay, thank you. I have one question for the panel, but I need to set it up. It is sensible that in a session on inequality that we focus on inequality, and I think that's absolutely right. But I wonder more generally how the social conversations that we have should concentrate on just inequality to the exclusion of all else. And I think we do that when we make statements like a society with a Gini coefficient of 0 is the perfect society. Lots of other things matter. My question concerns how much we place differential weights on those other things. If we say only inequality matters, I worry about how we are imposing an imperialism of view and opinion and judgment across other cultures, successful, thriving, proud cultures that are really quite different from ours. And that might, in those societies, the social judgment is that inequality matters, but even more so, mobility. How rapidly do those at the bottom of the income distribution rise? There are yet other societies that might think it important how we reward those who are successful at innovation and entrepreneurship, and that we should not reward those who do not try.
Okay.
So my question is, I'm curious what the panel might consider to be of similar importance to inequality, growth, mobility, expectation of possible success. And if we do consider those important, how much so compared to inequality?
Thank you very much. Excellent question. I don't know, Clive, if you feel that you would like to reply?
Yes, I would.
Yeah.
Very much so. I think you're right to say that there are many measures of inequality, and that one of the first and most important distinctions we all have to decide is whether we believe that the absolute or the relative should be the thing that guides us. Now, I work for the Resolution Foundation, which of course have got very well-defined and sophisticated ways of answering that, but I'll express my personal opinion that the absolute is more important than the relative. When I think about inequality in Britain, I am motivated by the desire to prevent both inhibiting poverty and overpowering wealth. I'm not really trying to end up with a single number at which everybody has the same. Societies, some of which have been referenced by Joe earlier, that have had that in the past, haven't been very nice places to live. You mentioned Soviet Russia. There's the story of Ivan and Vlad during the Khrushchev thaw, the period at which, after collectivization of farms, you were suddenly allowed, if you could get one, to own your own cow. And Ivan has a cow, Vlad doesn't. It eats Vlad up alive. Every night, when the house is asleep, he goes into a dark field and he says, God, I'm not allowed to believe in you. But if you're there, please, please, give me a cow. A month of such prayers go nowhere, and finally he says, God, just kill Ivan's cow. This isn't making any of us any happier. The issue is inhibiting poverty and overpowering wealth. When Joe talks about things other than money, it's because poverty is at the heart of some of the things which might make you unable to enjoy the fruits and freedoms that the rest of society has. It's okay to say in an undeveloped country that you've all got the right to free drinking water when there are no wells. That doesn't work. A freedom is not the same as the ability to enjoy it. In our country, there are many people who've got the right, apparent right, to a decent standard of living, but they are one paycheck away from absolute disaster. One broken boiler that they can't replace. One funeral of a family member they have to attend, but can't buy the train ticket for. You call that wealth or a good life? I don't. So that's inhibiting poverty. On the same measure, at the far end, overpowering wealth isn't good and healthy for a country either. It seeps into our politics, it seeps into capture, regulatory capture, business capture, societal capture. And as we've seen before, it can have very inhibiting impacts both on terms of property and indeed over time, or probably on economic growth as well.
Yeah, I mean, what I would like to add is that if I can draw a parallel between what happened in the 1980s and what happened over the last 10,000 years, there have been increasing trends of inequality, and in both cases, responsibility has not been taken of ensuring that access to wealth-making activities is equally distributed. And we now have technologies, we now have capabilities to do that. And so we are in a different position to some of the societies that I was talking about earlier. We have means of spreading opportunity that we have a responsibility to take.
So I'll just make one quick comment on that. So the issue of absolute and relative poverty is a really fascinating one. And there's a question of how are we going to define any poverty line. And one way this is done in the UK, and there are many ways, but one way is uses what's called the Breadline Britain survey. And this just asks people whether certain things are a necessity or not. And if something is called a necessity by 50% of the people, it's treated as, so it's very instrumental. Okay. But here are the top 4 items on the current list. So number 1 is 2 meals a day. Number 2 is a warm, waterproof coat. Number 3 is a warm, dry bed. Number 4 is being able to visit friends and family in hospital. And I was amazed when I read that, because I think it would never have occurred to me to put that on a list. But when you see it, it's obvious. Right? And so if your child is in hospital and you can't get the day off, or you can't get there, that's an absolute tragedy. But you would not have put that in a measure of absolute poverty. But it's something that would gnaw away at your life. It's not like the cow. It's not envy. It's a real psychological need. And I think one of the problems that we have when we talk about absolute poverty is we think about physical needs, but we think much less about psychological needs. And those are much more relative to the society that you live in. Now, I know that wasn't your question, but anyway, worth putting. So there must be another microphone somewhere. I'm letting the mics find their home. Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Thank you very much for your time, for coming here and speaking to us. My question is about like the future, especially with the artificial intelligence on the rise. It's going to increase this income inequality with human beings replaced by machines because they are going to be more efficient and less costly. Some say, like, that universal basic income could be one of the solutions to the people who are going to be laid off, but that really loses the sense of purpose and dignity for us as human beings. What do you think could be the solution and long-term approach for governments and as policymakers to be concerned about this even more rising levels of inequality? And do you think entrepreneurship could be a solution to this global problem that we are going to face in the future? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So that looks like one for you, Clive, if you want to.
Dean Woods and I earlier today were discussing what are the great challenges that require you to make 10 or 15-year huge changes and leaps in the way a country is run. We were talking about the immediate post-war period being a time in which we were still able as a country to find a way in this country to introduce a welfare state and freedom from the 5 fears. So I think it's possible for us to tackle big challenges of the type you just described with collective effort, clarity, and a common understanding that it's going to take some incremental and quantum change. In terms of the arrival of robots, I believe we're in that kind of requirement for collective, coherent change. Earth has received the memo from the planet X saying, we are much better than you at doing what you do, we're infinitely replicable, we don't make mistakes, we're in a spaceship, and as a courtesy, we're telling you we'll be there in 10 or 15 years. Don't you think we should call some kind of convention that says how we're going to respond to the arrival of that kind of threat to what you just described, which is not just an economic outcome, it's a social outcome. Work has purpose, it's got convening power, it gives us some sense of how society can be collectively organised. We're going to have to respond probably economically in terms of taxing the owners of robots and using that for further redistribution, whether it goes all the way to, as some are asking for, some kind of universal basic income or not, it's certainly going to be somewhere on that graded path towards redistribution. But more than economically, as you've already put your finger on, it requires a social change. What's our responsibility to others? If robots can do some things, does that not liberate us to go and spend time holding the hand of an older person who just wants to tell us the same story she told us yesterday? Maybe we've got time for that now. Maybe we've got some purpose in doing that now. And maybe we reinvent the sense of the collective as a response. But it will be a 10 or 15-year challenge, and we ought to get real about it.
Can I just add to that? If I can draw another distant link between the robot question and the using animals essentially as robots, what I was discussing with animal traction. You can see what the long-term impact of that was under varying institutional arrangements. So it's a very relevant question. That was my only comment.
Yeah. That's really interesting. So I was maybe going to make a remark in the opposite direction, which was, so when Karl Marx was born, the fastest way of getting anywhere was by horse. By the time he wrote the Communist Manifesto, maybe 28 years later, there was a national rail network in the UK. So we tend to forget how fast technical change has been in the past and how the world has adapted. However, you asked about jobs, but Amy made the point about inequality. And certainly the National Rail Network brought in even bigger inequality than there was before. Okay, so where is the next? Well, Nairi, do you want to follow up on?
It's a quick question for Amy on Joe's comments. I know nothing about archaeology, but what interested me in the House 52 is that both the big and the little houses all seem to be mixed up together. And I just wondered, is that why they had to hide their food? Because their neighbours were poorer? And then in Knossos or in other places, I haven't got a clue what I'm talking about, but did the rich live together? And therefore, and when they did live together, did they have grander and grander houses because they didn't have to worry about the jealousy of their neighbours? But yes. I'd love to hear.
That is a fabulous question. yes, you're reading it rightly, that at Çatalhöyük, though we have the inequalities I pointed out in house size and storage capacity, they don't resolve themselves into enclaves of richer and poorer. Instead, there's a complete interdigitation. And I'm sure the issues of neighbor jealousy and surveillance that you alluded to are relevant to the secrecy, the privacy with which stores are treated, but also the importance of advertising through those animal installations, the cattle horns that I showed you, that the occupant, the family occupying that house, has been generous in the past in reminding people of that. At Knossos, it's a very different situation. All of the houses immediately around the palace are what are called villas. They are very posh. They have similar architectural features to the palace itself. I've been part of a team that's excavating a couple hundred meters south of the palace on a hill called the Ipsades Hill. We're digging the equivalent of, not quite a council estate house, but let's just say, something that is many, many times smaller than the villas that surround the palace. And yet it still has its own storage space. It still has its own production. We have actual stores of the crops that people were producing there and consuming in that house. And so it suggests that, on the one hand, there is a lack of social mobility there, and there is a lack of integrated living in the way that we saw at Çatalhöyük. But that smaller house still has control of its own subsistence. It seems to depend on the palace to take it through difficult periods in time. That seems to be the usefulness of that central institution. But it nevertheless has its own independent economy. And in fact, that house makes it through the destruction level. I haven't told you about the destruction level that flattens, well, not flattens, but that ends the institutional life of the palace itself. So the households outlive ultimately that central institution.
Okay, so we're running desperately short of time. So we'll take two more questions together and then we'll answer. So there's one here and I'm seeing one at the far back. Sorry, yeah. So we'll take you please first. Yeah.
So very fascinating presentations. I come from India, and the top 1% in India owns 73% of wealth. So when you were talking about the Gini coefficient, I was wondering. I'm an optimist, and I would really like to believe what you said, that yes, government policy is certainly one way by which we could address policy, this inequality. But given that that 1% is really the policymakers, the moment you look at them making policy and helping address inequality, it's hopeless because it's almost like they're snatching away something from themselves to give to someone else. It's almost that expectation. And therefore, what we are seeing really is that policies that are getting made are actually exacerbating inequality. And things that have been hard fought by those who are the have-nots, even transparency laws or employment guarantee laws, there's a huge pushback in terms of policy. So your thoughts?
Hurry, yep. I've got a clock here ticking me down here. So at the back, so very quickly, please, at the back.
So my question is more on the line of within country equality and between country inequality. So I fear that we are probably entering into a phase where within country inequality is giving rise to populist governments, which is now taking policies like cutting down on immigration, cutting down on aid, which is further widening between country inequality. So do you also see that trend?
Wow, okay, so Clive, two questions, I think. You take first go.
Okay, I mean, if I can do them in reverse order. I have very little to comment in terms of the question of whether populism, and you're absolutely right to observe it as a phenomena, is going to add to or take away from poverty or inequality. I think it may have other social dangers and certainly a threat to the body politic and to the democratic working of country democracy is something somewhat wider than merely a voting system. But I'm afraid I have very little to comment to in terms of what it will have as an impact on inequality. Too soon to tell would be the answer to that. In terms of the question about whether or not, given your sense of potential pessimism, about whether or not there's anything we can do when the rich rich control so much of national wealth that it seeps into, is the way we described earlier, the way in which policy is formed and in which governments control things. I can only really tie the two comments together and simply say that democracy is the only thing that matters more than equality. And we should have a mix of pessimism and optimism. My favourite Italian communist, and everybody should have a favourite Italian communist, was Antonio Gramsci. Antonio Gramsci said the following: we must have pessimism of the intellect, and you're right to hold it, but optimism of the will.
Okay. Amy, is there anything from history to add?
No, I can't top that quote.
So I think if there was ever a good place to end, it is on that quote from Gramsci. So I think this is, in more than one way, a historic panel. I think we'll remember this for a very long time. And let me thank the speakers. So there's drinks outside, I believe. Oh, so Callum, yeah.
So, ladies and gentlemen, you have all worked very hard today. It's been an enormous pleasure to have you stay with us through the day and engage in a very wide menu of